So I would like to acknowledge my gratitude for being able to live here in this amazing place called Turtle Island, and I am a settler. I'm a very fortunate person, and I feel like in many ways those of us that have benefited so much do have an obligation to give back to our community, and that's what I've tried to do.
The price that northern communities have paid for the electricity we turn on every morning when we turn on the light, have a shower, make toast and coffee. Most Winnipeggers don't think about it. I think about the price that's been paid. You know, the pros and cons of hydro development in northern Manitoba. It's been incredibly socially disruptive. It's been incredibly environmentally disruptive.
I mean, the source of Winnipeg's water has always been a mistake, like to draw water from a completely different biosphere. The impact that it had on the people that are in that area was a travesty. But I think it's positive that has been ameliorated to somewhat, at least that there's a road there now. At least there's been a recognition locally. Shoal Lake is the source of our water, and that's at the grace of the people that live there. You know, I think that's a positive development. So I should probably get up every morning and make a list of these things and not feel so negative about the state of the world.
I was president of the board for at least 10 years, lifetime resident of Winnipeg and Manitoba. I like to think I was an environmentalist from a child on. I was always very into nature and getting out in it.
I was a member of the United Paper Workers International Union when I worked in the pulp mill in the town where I was from. I was working in small newspapers and freelance journalism in Northern Ontario. Then I moved to take a job in the Northwest Territories, and then I came here. Things were already underway. Anne was already the coordinator. So I never had expertise on any of the things I talked about. So my role was to find out enough about it that I could tell more people.
My connection to environmentalism is I kind of live it every day. But I got involved formally, I would say after my oldest children were born, so we're going back 40 years now. That's when I really started to pay attention to it. And of course I was active in environmental and peace groups as a volunteer, and then I became eventually coordinator, then executive director of the Manitoba Eco-Network for many years, and now I continue on environmental stuff as a volunteer.
I worked in the Northwest Territories at the newspaper there. Well, it was interesting because there were no daily newspapers there, but my beat was the native issues. So there was Hay River is a place with a reserve right across the river. Probably should have hired somebody local to do it. I wrote an article about Meech Lake when it happened, writing about national issues there.
I went on to get a degree in biology at the University of Manitoba, and then I was fortunate enough to start a career at the Manitoba Museum, worked there for 30 years, and following that I worked for 10 years at the wildlife branch of the Department of Conservation. Along the way I was a member of a wide variety of groups like Nature Manitoba, past president of the organization. So I finished my last 5-year term as president a few years ago. I was president of the Manitoba chapter of the Wildlife Society, and I'm still on one of their committees, the Conservation Affairs Committee, dealing with government policy and the impact on wildlife in the province. If you look at statistics of organizations starting up and people getting out, self-propelled activities in nature, canoeing and everything, there was a peak in the 70s that hasn't been matched since. And so there were a lot of organizations that started up and really got going, like Western Canadian Wilderness Committee, Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society.
Other environmental groups around that time in the 80s that I recall, certainly Recycling Council of Manitoba was getting going, currently known as Green Action Centre.
Some were here all along. Nature Manitoba, formerly known as the Manitoba Naturalist Society, actually started in 1921. So it's now over 100 years old. But even it got a lot more active in the 70s.
I think the one Anne's involved in, I don't know if Concerned Citizens of Manitoba ever incorporated, but I think that one has stayed running based on the enthusiasm of the individuals.
On April 20th, 1988, the Manitoba Environmental Network held a candidates debate. Concerned citizens of Manitoba served the Assembly glasses of Red River water.
Concerned Citizens of Manitoba is, or I should say was, an environmental volunteer organization. It began out in Lac du Bonnet, Manitoba, primarily focused on nuclear issues and the nuclear waste question. So we did a lot of political theater. Our goal was to raise public awareness. And today it's hard to imagine, but back then we were just at the very beginning of the internet. So we didn't have social media. People that have been really instrumental over the years, there's a lot of them, and I hesitate to make a list because I'm going to miss somebody, right?
Experimental Lakes area, they used the weir to separate the lake and show the phosphate treated side versus the non-phosphate treated side, and those people like Jack Valentine, the guy that won the water prize from the University of Alberta, David Schindler, yes, they were heroes because they didn't just see it as science, but they saw it as science that needed to be explained. They did all the science to demonstrate it, but that photo they had, very helpful in getting legislation to get phosphates out of our lakes.
And so some people, you see them more, you hear about them more, but everybody is important. Brian Pinnell, who has also left us early on when we first got charitable status at the Eco-Network. He was really helpful around that. He was very engaged as a lawyer around hydro issues, the proposal to construct the Kanawapa Dam. He brought together amazing people to participate at Public Utilities Board hearings. He also played a very important role nationally at the Canadian Environmental Network. Another one was Don Sullivan. Don, again, has passed away since then, but what a passionate person when it came to forest protection. Really, I think, instrumental in protected area on the east side of Lake Winnipeg. And very engaged with the Indigenous community in that area. I think he brought a lot of really important dimension and understanding to environmental questions.
So it's been a long time involvement with a variety of organizations, but definitely one of the highlights was the Manitoba Eco-Network. It was sometime, I think, in the late 70s, early 80s. I like to think it was an organic movement that said, hey, in each jurisdiction, we need a kind of a coordinating body for all these various groups that are coming together on environmental causes.
I think the organization was incorporated in 1987. Oh, 88, maybe it was 1988. Yeah, so that's where that later thing comes from, but there were informal meetings and stuff going on prior to that. I personally did not get involved really until probably 84, 85, somewhere in there. I think that was my first meeting that I ever went to. So the whole idea around the Eco-Network was that we would be a supportive organization to other groups that were doing work. And back in the day, early on, we were very, very careful not to impede on the work of other organizations. So if somebody was doing like recycling work, that great, we will support you, we'll put information out, but we're not going to engage ourselves in that work. We used the Eco-Journal as we thought, a good vehicle for raising awareness, circulating information amongst people. We would have annual meetings where groups would come and talk about what they were doing to, again, share. We had our resource center, and again, this is pre-internet, really, beginning of internet days. So people were still using a lot of paper resources back then. We had a very nice dedicated environmental library. People actively borrowed materials from it. And I want to mention too, the people that I worked with here in the Eco-Network office, like there was the role of executive director, and then there was a role of coordinator for many years. So people I'm thinking of, like mostly women actually, but Jan Westland, Liz Dykman, Lee Smith, later Bev Sawchuk, all these folks, they were kind of like the backbone of the organization because they kept people in touch with each other. They kind of kept track of what was going on. They kept me on track. And they all played, I think, a really instrumental role. And not only that, all of them were engaged in their own environmental work as volunteers, as well as working for the Eco-Network. So, you knew that it was deep in their DNA and their passion. So I think those were really important folks as well.
Rather than communicating with all of the groups individually in each jurisdiction, each province, it would be a lot easier if there were one group that all the disparate environmental groups belong to, that they could communicate with, and that would then, put out their messages and coordinate consultation, etc.
It's not your job as an environmental organization to be politically correct in any way ever. Like, your job is to give people the straight goods on what's happening.
We had 3 channels that would do the evening news on TV, and then we had a few radio stations and newspapers. So, and environmental issues were nowhere to be seen. Like, this was not something that was top of mind for anybody. So our goal was to get them on the front page.
For example, resource use was a timetable put out back, I think, in the 60s, early 70s, that by this date we're going to run out of this, and by that date we're going to run out of that. We were going to run out of oil, we were going to run out of various minerals. Of course, there were economic arguments put forward that, well, as something becomes scarce, the price goes up, and therefore the usage will go down. It might run out, but it's going to take a lot longer than whatever the prediction was at the time. Experimental method in science is you try something, you fail, you go back, you make a hypothesis, and then you test it. And then through failure of that, you refine your hypothesis, and you go on until you find something. It works, right? The big experiment we're carrying on by pumping all these hydrocarbons into the environment is one that we may not be around to experience the second iteration of that experiment, right?
Before Manitoba decided to strategically double hog production in this province, nobody was worrying about the environmental implications of hog farms or hog barns, because typically they were like, a farmer had 150 hogs and, mostly took care of the problem on their own land. And it went to having these mega barns and springing up and going on cheap land, but was also probably the wrong land. Like, the place to put them, if you're going to put those big barns, is probably in the Red River Valley, where you've got, the thick clay soil, and you can maintain the effluent on the top. Whereas, they were like they were trying to go in places where there was like porous soil, where you're surely going to pollute the groundwater from. And so there was no regulation of that. So groups spring up, and it starts with the hog one. It started at the local level. I mean, like, it was predictable that there would be all these little fights in every little town where these hog barns were coming along, and our government just let that happen. Like, it didn't make any rules for where and or how or what conditions. It just said, let there be hogs, and that's why there was all those little neighbor versus neighbor battles all across the province.
There were groups that, maybe I'm going to forget their names, but were working on issues of nature and parks and wilderness, and as well as pesticides.
I remember the cosmetic pesticides thing, which was a big thing that Anne was involved in. I wasn't really involved in it, except that I really didn't like having malathion sprayed on me regularly.
Lobbied a number of the premier and a number of other individuals. We introduced the cosmetic pesticide ban. When the Progressive Conservative government rescinded the ban, so again, people were allowed to use 2,4-D and its various mixtures on their lawn. So again, we had toxic chemicals. The NDP government, during the election campaign, their representatives pledged to bring the ban back. They have not done so. The
cosmetic pesticides are just, like, there's no reason that you have to be, you're not doing agriculture here. Like, you've got a lawn, and like, who cares if you got dandelions? I was on the Civic Environment Committee for the City of Winnipeg, appointed by Glenn Murray, and so we were advisory to EPC, and I was there for 2 years, and we didn't meet with EPC yet. And so I'd see these people that are absolutely top-notch experts, like that the city with its budget wouldn't even be able to afford, and they're not being listened to. And so I said, what's the point? People want places to live and nice homes, but it's not sustainable as a city to, like, built on unserviced land, not just environmentally unsustainable, it's financially unsustainable. It's like the day before they were making their media announcement, in other words, everything is decided, then they decide to ask, oh, what does the Environment Committee think about this? That's how much attention was paid to it.
I do worry about products of human ingenuity may and are having, very serious impacts on human populations. Microplastics, for example, that are turning up inside all of our bodies.
Anyway, that's where my frustration comes from. It's not that there's people who oppose it or that, some oil company somewhere doesn't agree with me. It's that the people who model themselves after trying to do the right thing aren't.
So yeah, it's hard to stay positive. And I think for me, what kept me going through all the times that I was actually working in the trenches day after day was the people that I encountered that were working so hard across the board on all these issues. Amazing people, amazingly committed, amazingly knowledgeable, who were willing to look for different ways of doing things, were willing to talk to Indigenous people and say, how was this done before? Who were doing organic farming and being successful at it, who could demonstrate that renewable energy is actually a very viable alternative.
I see incredible progress, the stuff that's been done, and incredible change of public attitude and public concern, and we see it every day spring up spontaneously right here in our own backyards.
I'm really grateful for the opportunity that I had of working at the Eco-Network for so many years and being able to be a part of this vibrant community of people that see how important it is for us to have a living planet and good things for our community and our families. And that to me has been such a privilege, and I'm really fortunate to be able to have that. So there were all these people out there who were just amazing, and I would run across them every day. So not only was I getting all the bad news into my inbox all the time, but just being able to really remember that there are folks out there that were so dedicated and working so hard and making a difference and caring for each other. I mean, that's just so important.
That's right. People's concerns about water quality, you name it, social conditions, homeless people. I mean, those concerns are based on a foundation of awareness and action that we as communities and as organizations have created over these past several decades. And I'm proud of my role in that. I think I had a small part to play. And when I look back with great fondness on all the people that were involved and the organizations and the causes we felt so passionately about in those days, and some we saw fairly quick progress, and others it's taken till now. Human creativity is infinite. Look at any of the technology we're dealing with today, smartphones that didn't exist, the internet that didn't exist back in the 80s. The cell phones that were a brick came out in the 80s maybe. And whenever I hear from friends or family when they get discouraged about some facet of human behavior, the wonderful thing about we humans, our creativity is infinite. In my probably narrow perspective of being involved with the environmental community in Manitoba and nationally over these past 40 years, our assumption that other people's motivation is mainly benevolent, right? Is the way most of us deal with most other people most of the time. Those millions of acts of kindness, those millions of assumptions of benevolence that most of us are going to do the right thing by other people is what keeps our societies going. What does environmental justice mean to me?
Environmental justice to me means that we acknowledge everybody around us.
The older you get, the more you realize how complex issues are.
Having equal opportunities to participate in our communities, in our economies. It means that we pay special attention to folks who've been disadvantaged, either historically or currently, because it's still going on. I think it really means sharing, and it also means knowledge. It means knowledge about how we are so interconnected with the trees out there and the air and the birds and everything, that we are not separate from that. And I think that, to my mind, is like at the heart of environmental justice.
There are a million acts of kindness that go on every day in every society. That's what keeps society going.
All of those connections, and then our connections to the other people that we share the planet with. I think that sums it up for me. Appealing to people's better judgment and keeping the connections with people, understanding what it is that we all need as human beings, what we need as families and communities, and asking ourselves and asking the bigger community, is this something that's going to benefit our community now and going, like, let's say 7 generations? Like, is this what we want for our offspring and our grandchildren and great-grandchildren?
I just can't stress enough like how important it is to respect other people's strategies, like, and to understand that other people have the same goals as you, and that you need to respect that your decision to protest or go to a hearing or organize a boycott, that any of those are just tactics and strategy. Groups need not, argue about these things. They're all valid points of view, and it's more about where people, feel their own strengths.
We are starting to see the truth of what actually took place in this land that we call Canada, because I think without that knowledge, we can't really move forward, as they say, in a good way with everybody here together.
The background is like really a coordinated movement to drag us back on so many levels in terms of gender identity, racial equality, in terms of residential schools.
The Schools Act came in where any kid over 6 years old had to go to a school. And so where they used to take their families out on the trap line for the winter, they had to bring them in, and then of course they got scooped to residential school.
We took people out of their communities for tuberculosis, and then they died and never went back to their community. Where we took people away and died at residential schools feels dispiriting sometimes. We say the land acknowledgements everywhere, but where's the land? A fire in Northern Ontario is near some of the poorest reserves in Northern Ontario. Multinational diamond companies and rare earth minerals companies like drilling, and there is zero commitment that there will be anything going to the community that's just 20 kilometers away. It's in their hunting and trapping areas. And
again, I know this through my years as wildlife director. There was a time where most of the northern First Nations made their living seasonally. They would fish in the summer, they would trap in the winter. As hydro development spread through the north and mining towns, I would say there's virtually no one, or very, very few First Nations who now can make a living doing those seasonal occupations that were the standard for many decades.
Do some reparations in terms of sharing the resources that are being extracted. So there was Hay River is a place with a reserve right across the river, and it was the only reserve in the Northwest Territories. When the Mackenzie pipeline was being built, the people there were worried that all their land that they were negotiating for at the time was going to be like taken up. You drive up towards it, you drive and drive and drive and drive all the way from Edmonton. It's just like hours and hours. You feel like you're going to fall off the end of the earth. And then you drive into Hay River and there's these trees, and then you look and you see this like 18-story tower in a town of 1,500 people. We develop things quickly if there's like this economic imperative, but we're so slow when it's a social imperative.
I've spent a lot of time out on the land, and I think a lot about First Nations and how they lived and their attitude toward the land, and their respect for the land and the processes that go on there. It's of course not universal in their communities. They have troubles with people that go out and shoot pregnant moose and therefore help decimate the populations. So they acknowledged that in our public meetings with them, that they were part of the problem, but they were also bound and determined they would be part of the solution, and they are part of the solution. And yet the communities, by many measures, are prospering. Metrics like education, illness, infant mortality, participation at education right up to the university level, participation in looking out for their own interests through consultation on anything and everything that happens in their areas. All of these things to me are very positive fortunately through the work that I had and through my advocation in environmental groups. My appreciation is for that whole background, the fact that those communities, those societies were able to make a living, and prosper and raise children and everything else and create fabrics of society under conditions that none of us would survive any length of time in. I'm very much encouraged by First Nations, from what I see in the Métis folks, of their insistence that they have a point of view that is important to be shared with the rest of us, and a worldview, a cultural view, and I respect that and value that. I have faith that we will do the right thing ultimately. Unfortunately, history does seem to be determined to repeat itself.
My point is that sometimes it appears that everybody's on the same side, but if you scratch a little deeper, they aren't. And if somebody is like foot dragging, there could be good reasons for it, where it's difficult or slow or expensive or whatever, but it also could mean that they're not really ever seriously going to do anything. You need to talk to people who want to do things. I think great things can happen when you've got industry and government and science all working together. I think the problem on climate change is that it's not the case. Like, government's never been completely on board. Industry is largely opposed to doing something about climate change. It's an emergency though. Climate change is an emergency.
One session where we had two people in hazmat suits tossing a massive dice down the steps of the legislature, while another group of us was in meeting with the Environment Minister, lobbying for, what we were lobbying for was the High-Level Radioactive Waste Act. And the notion of the dice was we're playing a game of dice, we're gambling with people's future, right? We had a mocked up radioactive waste truck, so it was a really old flatbed truck with these big old painted yellow barrels with a radioactive sign on them. The truck would go from place to place. It would look like stuff was spilling out. Well, I was at home just a few blocks away, and a little while later I hear sirens. And somebody had reported this leaking truck of radioactive waste. They closed all of Jubilee Avenue. They had 14 different emergency response crews.